Cops arrest black man for trespassing, then learn he's the FBI. He had lived in the neighborhood for years. The house, the yard, the front porch with the creaking steps, it was his. Every brick and beam had been paid for with long hours, late nights, and sacrifices most people would never know about. Yet to the officers who pulled up with flashing lights and hardened faces, none of that mattered. To them, he was just another man who didn't belong. It started like any other evening. He had just returned from work, still dressed sharp, briefcase in hand, unlocking his own front door. But before he could even step inside, the shouting began. A voice rang out across the quiet street. "Hey, what do you think you're doing here?" At first, he thought it was a mistake, some misunderstanding with a neighbor. But when he turned, he saw uniforms, badges, guns, and eyes that had already judged him guilty. Neighbors peeked from their curtains. Some filmed with their phones. Whispers traveled faster than the sirens that hadn't even left yet. To the watching crowd, it looked like a man caught red-handed trying to break into a house that wasn't his. To him, it felt like the air had been stolen from his lungs. He tried to speak, to explain. But the hands on holsters, the sharp commands, the way they closed in told him this wasn't going to be simple. He wasn't just being questioned. He was being hunted on his own doorstep. And as the tension built, one thought burned in his mind. They have no idea who I really am. Because this wasn't just any man. This wasn't someone lost or confused or sneaking where he shouldn't be. This was an FBI agent, a man who had sworn to uphold the law, who had put criminals behind bars, who had spent years protecting the very same country that now questioned his right to stand on his own lawn. But none of that mattered to them in that moment. They didn't see an agent. They didn't see a homeowner. They didn't see a man. They saw only what they wanted to see. And when the truth came out, it would shake every single person on that street. He wasn't just any man with a nice house in the suburbs. He was someone who had built his life from the ground up. His name was Marcus, and everything he owned carried the weight of struggle, discipline, and relentless perseverance. Growing up, Marcus didn't have much. He was raised in a cramped apartment on the south side of the city, the kind of place where sirens at night were just background noise, where kids learned too early that the world didn't hand out second chances. His mother worked 2 jobs, his father long gone, and Marcus had to fight for every inch of stability he found. But he wasn't the kind to give up. He had seen what happened to people who let the world's cruelty break them, and he swore he'd never be one of them. Through late nights of studying by dim light, through discipline carved from years of hardship, Marcus excelled. He earned scholarships, took opportunities that others overlooked, and carved a path that led him far from where he began. But even as he rose, he carried with him the memory of those early years, the humiliation of being underestimated, the sharp sting of being treated as less than. That drive eventually pushed him into law enforcement. But Marcus didn't want to be just another cop. He aimed higher, toward an agency where justice was supposed to mean more than appearances, toward the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It wasn't an easy road. Grueling training, endless background checks, psychological evaluations, all designed to break down the weak. But Marcus didn't break. He became one of the Bureau's finest working complex cases, dismantling criminal networks, putting away people who thought they were untouchable. Yet, despite his badges, titles, and achievements, Marcus never forgot where he came from. The world still had its shadows, its blind spots, its prejudice, and he knew, even with all his credentials, there would always be moments when people looked at him and saw only their own assumptions staring back. That's why the house meant so much. Years of long hours, of missed birthdays, of sacrifices no one but him would understand, had finally culminated in this place. A beautiful brick home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, a safe place for his family. It wasn't just property, it was proof. Proof that he had made it. Proof that the struggles of his youth hadn't been in vain. Neighbors waved when he passed, Kids rode bikes down the sidewalk, and for the first time, Marcus allowed himself to feel a little at peace. But beneath that peace was always an awareness that not everyone saw him the same way. Some greeted him warmly. Others watched from behind drawn blinds, eyes narrowed, whispers carrying in tones they thought he couldn't hear. Still, Marcus chose not to dwell on it. He had worked too hard to let suspicion steal his peace. Until one evening, that ordinary evening when he pulled into his driveway after a long day at the bureau, everything shifted. The sun was low, the street quiet, the air still heavy with late summer heat. Marcus parked his black SUV, grabbed his briefcase, and walked toward the front door. He paused, as he often did, to take in the sight of his home. The neatly painted shutters, the welcome mat his daughter had picked out, the small flower garden his wife tended with care. To anyone else, it was just another house. To him, it was everything. And that's when he noticed it, the slow roll of a police cruiser down the street. At first, he didn't think much of it. After all, this was a safe neighborhood, the kind of place where patrol cars weren't unusual. But something about the way it slowed, the way the officers inside seemed to fix their eyes on him, made the air thicken. He inserted his key into the lock, unaware that within minutes, his life would spiral into a scene he had faced too many times before. But never like this. Because this time, it wasn't just about perception. It was about power, prejudice, and the chilling reality of what happens when justice is blinded by bias. And on this night, Marcus's very identity, the truth of who he really was, would collide with the false image painted by strangers in uniform. Marcus had just turned the key in the lock when he heard it, the crunch of tires against pavement slowing behind him. He glanced over his shoulder, his instincts sharpened by years in the bureau. The patrol car had come to a full stop in front of his driveway. 2 officers sat inside, their eyes fixed on him like predators circling prey. He sighed. He knew this look. He had seen it too many times before, only this time it was aimed at him, right in front of his own home. "Evening," Marcus said calmly, giving a polite nod before returning his attention to the door. He hoped to diffuse whatever suspicion simmered behind those windshields. But the click of a car door opening froze him in place. "Hey! Step away from the door!" a voice barked. Marcus turned slowly. One officer, tall and heavyset, had stepped out. His partner followed, hand resting dangerously close to his holster. Their eyes weren't curious. They were hostile. "This your house?" the tall one demanded. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Yes, it's my house." The officers exchanged a glance, smirks playing at the corners of their mouths as if they'd just caught him in a lie. "Got ID to prove that?" the second officer asked, his tone sharp, accusatory. Marcus held back the urge to roll his eyes. He knew exactly what was happening, and the bitter taste of it settled on his tongue. He placed his briefcase down slowly, deliberate in his movements. He had seen too many lives shattered in seconds by the wrong gesture. "I do," he replied evenly. "I'll show you. But I'd like to know why I'm being asked." The tall officer's lip curled. "We got a call about a suspicious person on this property. Dark clothing, carrying a bag, matches you." Marcus swallowed his frustration. Suspicious person? He was walking into his own home. But he knew better than to argue. He pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license. The officer snatched it, barely glancing at the name and address before shaking his head. "Doesn't prove anything. Could have taken it off the real owner." The words hit like a slap. The real owner. As if a black man couldn't possibly belong here. Marcus stayed calm on the surface, but beneath, his blood simmered. Years of restraint, of controlling his reactions in situations like this, coiled tightly inside him. "Sir," Marcus said slowly, keeping his voice measured, "I am the owner. That's my name. That's my address. I work for—" He stopped himself. Revealing too much now could escalate things even further. The second officer stepped closer, circling him like prey. "Funny thing is," he sneered, We get a lot of folks claiming they belong where they don't. A lot of break-ins lately. You don't mind us checking, do you? Marcus clenched his jaw. He could feel the neighbors peeking through blinds, some already stepping onto porches. Whispers floated across the street. In their eyes, this wasn't Marcus, a respected FBI agent, a man who had sacrificed everything for justice. No. To them, right now, he was just a suspect. The tall officer motioned toward the briefcase. What's in the bag? Work files, Marcus answered flatly. Mind if we take a look? That was the breaking point. They weren't asking, they were demanding. His work files weren't just personal, they were confidential federal documents. No, Marcus said firmly, locking eyes with the officer. You may not. The air thickened. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the second officer's hand shifted closer to his gun. Why not? He pressed. Unless you've got something to hide. The accusation stung. Marcus felt the weight of every injustice he had witnessed in his life pressing down on him. He had done everything right, stood tall, obeyed the law, carried himself with dignity. And still, here he was, in front of his own home, treated like a criminal. The murmurs around them grew louder. A teenager across the street raised his phone, recording. Marcus knew how quickly this could spiral out of control. He had trained men like these. He had read reports of nights that ended in tragedy. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from anger, from indignation, from the knowledge that no matter what he had achieved, the color of his skin still painted him guilty in their eyes. And he realized they had no idea who they were dealing with. Because Marcus wasn't just a man standing in front of his home. He wasn't just another black face they could push around. He was the FBI. And in a matter of minutes, the entire situation was about to turn upside down. The air was electric, thick with tension. The two officers squared up to Marcus as if they had cornered a criminal. Flashing red and blue lights painted streaks across his driveway now. More patrol cars had arrived. 3 more officers stepped out, forming a half circle around him. What had started as suspicion was escalating into something dangerous, and Marcus knew all too well how quickly things could turn fatal. One of the officers muttered into his radio, his eyes never leaving Marcus. Another barked, "Sir, step away from the door, hands on your head, now!" Marcus didn't move. His heart was pounding, but not with fear. With every second, his fury burned hotter. He had worked too long, fought too hard, and given too much to this country to stand here, in his own driveway, treated like a threat. The crowd of neighbors had grown. Phones were out. Whispered commentary spread like fire. To them, this scene was yet another headline waiting to be written. A black man against a wall of uniforms. Another tragedy waiting to unfold. But Marcus knew something the crowd didn't. Something the officers clearly had no clue about. He inhaled deeply, steadying his voice. Then, with deliberate calm, he pulled out his second badge. Not his driver's license, not his homeowner's ID, but his shield. Gleaming under the harsh glare of the patrol lights, the letters were unmistakable. FBI. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The tall officer's eyes widened, his bravado faltering as he stared at the badge. His partner shifted nervously, his hand sliding away from his holster. The younger officers who had just arrived exchanged quick, confused glances, unsure of what they were seeing. Marcus's voice cut through the silence, low but commanding. You've just threatened, harassed, and attempted to unlawfully detain a federal agent on his own property. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you've just walked into? The words hit harder than any shout could. His tone wasn't angry. It was controlled, precise, deadly serious. One of the younger cops stammered, "Sir, we didn't know." Marcus stepped forward, his gaze piercing. That's exactly the problem. You didn't know. You didn't care to know. You saw my skin, not my credentials. You saw suspicion, not a homeowner. You saw danger where there was none. Gasps rippled through the neighbors. Phones zoomed in closer. The image of Marcus standing tall, badge in hand, surrounded by officers who suddenly looked like children caught misbehaving, was burned into every witness's mind. The tall officer swallowed hard. His arrogance crumbled, but he tried to recover. "Look, Agent, we were just responding to a call." Marcus cut him off, his voice booming with authority. "Don't you dare minimize this. You escalated, you profiled, you put your hands near your weapons for a man unlocking his own door. That isn't just a mistake. That's negligence. That's racism. And it ends here." The tension snapped. The officers shifted uncomfortably. One stepped back, another lowered his head, ashamed. The tall one, their unofficial leader, looked pale under the flashing lights. Marcus took another step forward, holding his badge high for everyone to see. "I will be filing a full report with your department. And I promise you, this doesn't get buried. Not this time." The crowd erupted, some clapping, some cheering, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The teenager holding his phone whispered, "He's FBI." Loud enough for half the block to hear. The power dynamic had flipped completely. Where moments ago Marcus stood surrounded and accused, now the officers were the ones cornered, exposed, and humiliated. One officer muttered, "We should go," his voice barely audible. But Marcus wasn't done. He wanted every word to sink in. "Let this be a lesson," he said, his voice echoing through the street. "The next time you see a black man in his own home, remember this moment. Remember who I am. Because the next person you target might not have a badge to protect him." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. The officers backed away, retreating toward their cars. Their authority had dissolved into shame. The neighbors' eyes followed them like spotlights. And Marcus, standing tall, unwavering, knew that this night wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been questioned, doubted, or threatened simply for existing in the wrong place, in the wrong skin. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The flashing lights eventually dimmed as the patrol cars retreated into the night. But the weight of what had happened didn't vanish with them. The driveway still hummed with whispers, phones buzzing as neighbors uploaded shaky videos that would soon spread far beyond this block. Marcus stood in the glow of his porch light, his badge still firm in his grip, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of a man who refused to be broken. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, people began to drift away, some shaken, some energized. A few stopped to squeeze Marcus's shoulder, nodding in solidarity. The teenager with the phone muttered, "You showed them," before walking off into the night, eyes wide as if he had just witnessed history. Inside his house, Marcus finally sank into a chair. The adrenaline ebbed, but the reality of what had just unfolded hit him with full force. He wasn't just another black man targeted in front of his own home. He was an FBI agent, and still, that hadn't protected him. His training, his title, his badge, none of it mattered until he made it matter, until he revealed it. And that realization was heavier than any confrontation he'd faced in his career. The next morning, the videos were everywhere. Clips of Marcus holding his badge against the blinding patrol lights went viral on social media. Headlines screamed across platforms, "Cops harass black man in driveway, then learn he's FBI." Comment sections exploded. Some people cheered his composure, calling him a hero. Others questioned how many incidents like this never got recorded. How many black men weren't lucky enough to have a badge or a camera watching. Marcus's phone buzzed non-stop. Fellow agents called, some with pride in their voices, others with quiet anger. "Man, I saw the video. That could have gone bad. Real bad." A supervisor left a voicemail. "We'll talk about next steps. This won't be swept under the rug." But Marcus wasn't thinking about bureaucratic meetings or internal memos. He was thinking about the millions watching, about the parents who would share this video with their kids as both a warning and a lesson. He thought about his own niece, who had once asked him why the world always seemed to see her as trouble before she even spoke. That night, Marcus sat at his desk staring at the report he was drafting. Every detail mattered. The tone of the officers' voices, the hands on holsters, the way his neighbors gasped when he pulled out his badge. He wrote not just as an agent, but as a black man who had lived the double life of being respected in uniform and suspected out of it. He knew his words carried weight, and he wasn't going to waste them. The department tried to get ahead of the storm. Press releases claimed the officers were responding to a suspicious activity call and followed protocol. But the videos told a different story. They showed hesitation, fear, and bias, laid bare for millions to dissect. Soon, the story wasn't just about Marcus. It became a flashpoint. Local activists called for retraining and accountability. News outlets replayed the confrontation on loop, analysts debating what it meant for law enforcement culture. Some officers quietly reached out, admitting that the problem was bigger than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Others doubled down, defensive, unwilling to confront the truth. Marcus didn't need the attention. He hadn't wanted the spotlight. But he realized he had a responsibility now, not just as an FBI agent, but as a man who had stood in that driveway and said enough. Weeks later, he stood at a podium facing a crowd at a community forum. Cameras rolled, reporters scribbled. The room buzzed with anticipation. He didn't use legal jargon or polished talking points. He spoke plainly, from the gut. "I've worn this badge for years," he began, holding it up again. "It represents protection, law, justice. But the truth is, this badge only protected me when I showed it. Before that, I was just another black man they thought didn't belong." The room fell silent. "And that," Marcus continued, voice heavy with conviction, "is the problem. This can't just be about training or policy. It has to be about seeing people as human beings before you see them as suspects. About recognizing dignity before assuming danger. About remembering that every single one of us has the right to be safe in our own home." The applause was thunderous. Some rose to their feet. Others wept quietly, nodding as if he had spoken the words they'd been waiting to hear for years. But Marcus wasn't finished. He leaned into the microphone, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. "Ask yourself this. If I hadn't been FBI, if there hadn't been cameras, how would this story have ended? How many more stories end differently, without witnesses, without evidence, without justice? And how long are we willing to accept that?" The rhetorical question lingered in the air, heavy and unanswerable. That was the point. In the weeks that followed, policies began to shift. Officers were pulled from the field for retraining. Investigations were launched. Departments across the state quietly began revisiting their bias protocols, not because they wanted to, but because the public demanded it. And Marcus? He went back to work, but not unchanged. Every time he pinned his badge to his chest, he felt its weight differently. It wasn't just a shield anymore. It was a reminder of the night he stood on his own driveway, targeted for the color of his skin, and chose to fight back not with fists, but with truth. To this day, people still share the video. Some share it as proof of systemic failure, others as inspiration, a reminder that dignity, courage, and composure can flip the script in the darkest moments. But Marcus knew the real impact wasn't in the views or headlines. It was in the conversations around dinner tables, the uncomfortable questions in classrooms, the training rooms where young officers were forced to watch and reflect. It was in the seeds planted, however small, for change. And for every person who watched that clip and asked themselves, what if it was me? What if it was my son, my brother, my father standing there? Marcus's fight had already mattered. Because sometimes one night, one confrontation, one man refusing to back down, can spark a conversation the world can't ignore.